There we go. Cool.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody to the Lubeck Library. Thank you for coming. Tonight is kind of a special presentation because it's our first annual Nancy and Harold Fogelson event. And the Fogelson family is sitting in the front row here. And it's because of their parents' generosity to the library that there will be able to do this program and many other programs through the years. And every year, Nancy and Harold both were avid readers, avid library users, and had such a breadth of interests. And it was always a joy to see them come into the library. So I think finding topics that they might have been interested in will be kind of easy because they like so many different things. So I'm pleased to have our first annual Nancy and Harold Fogelson event. And I'm also pleased to introduce Stephanie's son, Morgan, and Sienna, whose last names I don't remember, who are all from the Gulf of Maine Research Institute in Portland and have been doing some work up here on sea level rise and climate change. So I'll turn it over to you, Stephanie.
Thanks so much for the intro, and just thank you all so much for sharing this wonderful town with us. This is my first time up during the summer. I came at the end of November last year. It's very different, but no less lovely. So we're really excited to be here. As mentioned, we're coming up from Portland, and today we'll be talking about rising seas and warming waters, so climate change in the Gulf of Maine. But our hope with this presentation is that you don't leave feeling upset and sad. Hopefully you can walk away feeling hopeful and knowing some ways in which you can contribute to addressing climate change. So to begin, the Gulf of Maine Research Institute works to develop and deliver collaborative solutions to global ocean challenges, and I'll get into what that means in a minute. So we think about global ocean challenges across 4 categories. The first is seafood sustainability, healthy ocean ecosystems, the thriving blue economy, and then underpinning all of that is really this huge issue that we're looking to address, which is climate change, and that underpins all of the kind of efforts that we undertake at GMRI. So when we think of climate risks to the Gulf of Maine, there are a lot of them, from warming waters to sea level rise, nutrient runoffs and harmful algal blooms, all of which affect coastal communities here in Maine. And even as we look at some of these really scary hazards and impacts, at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute and at the Municipal Climate Action Program, which is where the 3 of us work at GMRI, we also like to think about how climate change presents an opportunity for us to work together in creating these thriving coastal communities. So while climate poses a ton of challenges, there's also a really great opportunity to be investing in sustainable fisheries, resilient infrastructure, healthy coastal zones, diversified economies, climate change literacy, equity and justice in communities, and then of course, given the fact that we are in Maine, this renewed sense of place, identity, and pride in place as well. So we operate through a science engagement and solutions framework, and so science can be the research that's being done in our laboratories on species distributions, on ecosystem modeling, or it can be science that we're doing in classrooms through our middle school lab ventures program, where students come through our lab for a day of learning about the Gulf of Maine ecosystem. But that science really doesn't mean much unless stakeholders have it. So we also engage with our stakeholders to make sure that they have the science that they need to be making the decisions that they need to make. And those stakeholders can be fishermen, students, educators, municipal planners, etc. Then we also work with those stakeholders and leveraging engagement opportunities to determine what solutions we might be able to deploy here. That can be data, it can be specific tools, but really these 3 components work hand in hand. GMRI is not always bringing the science, we're not always bringing the solutions, we're not always bringing the engagement. Oftentimes that also comes from communities, it comes from fishermen, it comes from our teachers and municipal planners as well, working together. So to give a brief overview of what I'll be talking about today, I'll start off with a brief overview of resilience, what it means and why it matters. I'll talk about some of the climate change hazards and impacts we're seeing in Maine. I'll talk a little bit about the Maine State Climate Action Plan. I'll talk a little bit about the science of hope, and then I'll be able to hand it over to Morgan to talk about our coastal flooding community science project. Before I dive into everything, I want you all to take a moment and chat with each other and share what it is you love about Lubeck. As I mentioned, climate change is just such a huge challenge. It's really difficult to talk about, and we can feel really powerless when we think about all the challenges that are on the horizon. We find it's really helpful to think about the things that we love and the things that we value and want to protect in the face of climate challenges. So, for example, this is a photo that was taken of me. It was after I graduated from undergrad the day before I left Maine to travel all the way across the world for a new job. And in that moment, I said, it's my last night in Maine, I have to get in the water. I have to be, connected to this amazing coast. And so this is an image I think about a lot in my work. And this is sort of what I think about when I need to sort of dig deep and think, well, why am I doing what I'm doing? So I'll turn it over to you to chat with your neighbors. Think about what is it you love and what do you want to protect. All right, so let's bring it back. And
That's not easy.
I know,
to bring
it is
back.
hard. Should have brought a
Can you
whistle.
whistle? Right.
I know, I unfortunately can't. All right, so to bring it all back really quickly. I did used to teach, but I don't quite want to break out those skills just yet, but I can do the clapping if that would work. All right, okay, thank you. Awesome, all right, so.
Time for the program.
Now that you all have talked a little bit about what it is that you love, I just want you to hold on to that throughout this presentation. In those moments where you're like, yikes, that graph looks really scary, go back to that moment, go back to that place. All right, so let's talk a little bit about resilience. This word is used a lot. It's being used a lot within the state when it comes to climate planning. And resilience can mean a wide range of things. So the typical engineering definition of resilience is the ability of a system to bounce back after a disaster. So we could think about resilience in terms of an extreme weather event or a storm. How quickly was a town or community able to bounce back from that or come back to the original conditions, right? And recover. That's a really great definition of resilience. And I think there's a really awesome way of defining resilience in terms of what can we bounce forward into. So what are the new opportunities, the new futures, the new things that we can imagine following an extreme event or disturbance? And so resilience exists at many levels that interact with one another. There's individual resilience, so you as a person, how are you resilient? When something bad happens, who do you turn to? How are you able to recover? And from there, we can move up and think about neighborhood level resilience. How do people in neighborhood work together to support one another in overcoming obstacles or barriers? From there, we can think about resilience in terms of a community more broadly and an industry more broadly. then from the state, and even beyond to a global community. What's really nice about recognizing how our resilience is interconnected is that it creates opportunities for you to lean on one another. Where one person might have a generator in the winter and someone else doesn't, right? How can you share that resource? And a lot of it comes down to just being like neighborly, right? Which I think we're pretty good at here in Maine. And at the same time, the resilience you have at an individual level can help push us and move us towards being able to lean on each other at a neighborhood level. It can start to tip the scale as we think about community resilience more broadly, and then actions that are happening in the state. A lot of the current action that's being taken starts from the bottom up. Starts because of what an individual wants. They talk to their neighbors, they talk to their community, and so it moves up in that way. So that's one way in which even just being here today and talking to your neighbors is a form of climate resilience and a way in which that climate resilience can be built. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit more about climate change in the Gulf of Maine. So we'll start off with temperature. So as you can see in the Gulf of Maine, we've been seeing increases in air temperatures. And I'll explain these three different lines in just a minute. But in Maine, temperature changes are driven by kind of those global forces, but they're also regional patterns that influence temperature here. And those come from the North Atlantic Oscillation and the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. And so we see variations in weather and temperature patterns here. And that kind of explains those rises and falls that we see within the graph. But overall, the trend is increasing. So by 2050, we can expect between 2 and 4 degrees Fahrenheit of a temperature increase in the Gulf of Maine. And that could be as high as 10 degrees Fahrenheit by 2100. But I do want to bring your attention back to these lines. So there are 3 possibilities that have been modeled for temperature in the Gulf of Maine. We've got this lower one over here, which tracks us at about 2 degrees Fahrenheit of change. And then we have this more intense, a little bit more scary one that brings us to that 10 degrees. And the reason that we have...
Stephanie, you're talking water temperature or air temperature?
Air temperature.
Air temperature.
Yeah, thank you. The reason that we have that variation is because climate models run on, I'm going to say this wrong. I'm going to check in my notes to make sure I say it correctly. Representative concentration pathways, which essentially describe our emissions moving forward, right? And so there are different ways and amounts that we will emit. And that all depends on sort of the social and policy decisions that we make. So that lower level of warming that we might expect, or temperature increases that we might expect, are if we cut emissions right now. That higher end would be if we continue to emit at the rate that we're emitting at. That middle of the road line is if we continue to enact policies that help us curb our emissions. So as we look at this, that's another area where you can really be taking action, is in emissions reduction. And that is a kernel of hope.
Right, could you just read the dates under the dark lines? I'm too far back to be able to read them.
No problem. This line says 2050, and this line is 2100. Over here is 2010 when we started, that modeling. Right. So in terms of why temperature change matters, we can lump it into 2 broad buckets, recognizing that there are many ways in which this intersects. So the first is there are significant impacts for our economy. So as temperatures rise, the warm season is getting longer and the winter season is getting shortened, and snow and ice is melting at a faster rate. That has really significant impacts to our winter recreation economy. You'll see articles about that in the newspaper fairly regularly now. And as that's happening, we're also seeing the summer growing season extend by about 2 weeks. And that in and of itself is pretty interesting because that's an opportunity, right? We might be able to grow things in Maine that we haven't been able to grow before. And with that comes risk because there's still so much that we don't know moving into the future. There are also pretty significant impacts for health and well-being. So this past heat wave that we had in June, so over 100 people admitted to the hospital for heat-related illnesses. And as we look at sort of health data, we can see that we have spikes in ER visits when we experience temperature extremes here in Maine. And the important thing about health and well-being is that, it's very different to be experiencing a heat wave as somebody who works in the outdoor industry, somebody who's outside in 90 degrees for 8 hours a day. It's also incredibly different to experience 90 or 95-degree heat as a toddler or as somebody over the age of 65 versus if you're sort of a young adult. So that's an area where it's really important to not pay attention just to the potential risk, but really pay attention to who's being impacted the most. So in terms of temperature and what we can do, again, a lot of these kind of fly across that range of individual to neighborhood to community or industry actions. So one thing we can do is modify infrastructure, whether that's removing pavement and planting more trees, which have a cooling effect. There is also guidance now for cooling centers. So towns can actually create centers. A library would be a perfect place for it, where people can go to cool down during a heat wave, and there's guidance for that. There are other ways in which we can evolve operations. So coming from the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, I'm going to put a little fishy twist on probably almost everything. But this last year, the state created new regulations for oyster harvesters, so that once they harvest oysters, they need to get their product on ice much faster than they would have had to in the past to reduce the risk of those oysters being spoiled, which has impacts both for those aquaculture businesses, but also for human health. And then the other thing about heat is, again, coming down to that idea of being a good neighbor. Right? What are the ways in which we can take care of one another? Many cities throughout the US and beyond have programs where people check in on their neighbors, particularly if they are elderly or disabled, to make sure that they're okay during a heat wave. To move on to precipitation. So Maine's climate is getting wetter, and there's more high intensity precipitation events. So now Maine receives about 1 to 2 additional days of 2-inch rainfall events. So where it's raining more than 2 inches within one day, that is a lot of water. And then we're experiencing about 2 or 3 more days of rainfall greater than 1 inch. And so this is an increase from half a century ago. And so we're seeing more rain and snow, but we're also seeing more variations in that rain and snow. So more intense wet periods and longer dry periods. Mm-hmm. And that's because our hydrological cycle is intensifying and it's moving faster. So water is cycling through land, air, and oceans faster. And so the variability of precipitation through the years causes a lot of challenges, right? So as we can see, in 2020, we had the driest growing season here in Maine. On the other hand, in 2023, we also had the wettest summer. So it's just incredibly hard to plan for all of that variation. So last summer, a lot of crops didn't make it. If you tried to go apple picking in the fall, it was almost impossible. Sorry about that. And then again, why precipitation impacts matter. We can look at it across health and well-being, the economy, and our ecosystems. And precipitation is an issue because of sort of 2 factors. The first is water quantity, so the amount of water, and water quality. So the amount of water that we get has the potential to overwhelm our already aging infrastructure here in Maine. And so we see a lot of overflows, which create hazards if we're looking at, what roads do we need to access to go about our daily lives, or even, during an emergency. This fact about the mosquitoes was really interesting to me. It turns out that we expect to see more mosquitoes here in Maine, and that change is driven more by precipitation than it actually is temperature. So with ticks, has more to do with temperature. With mosquitoes, it has more to do with the amount of standing water that we have, right? So that's a hazard to human health and safety. Again, when it comes to the economy, there's that example of how difficult it is to plan with the growing seasons here in Maine. But also it only takes a 2-inch rainfall event to trigger a closure of shellfish beds, which means you can't harvest and you can't sell those products. So that has very significant impacts. I mean, here in Lubec, for example, where you have such a large and important digging community as well. And then again, the water quality impacts that come with rain running over land, picking up things like fertilizer, debris, dog poop is the one no one wants to talk about, but is really significant, all the bacteria in animal waste. And that feeds into our ecosystems and can cause impacts like harmful algal blooms as well, which really affect the entire ecosystem. It can cause deoxygenation in the water, et cetera. So again, thinking about what we can do, we can modify and invest in infrastructure. The state does have guidelines for managing stormwater impacts, and there currently is quite a bit of investment that's going into managing stormwater. At the same time, there are different kind of designs and tools that you can implement, like bioretention pools that kind of capture and filter the water, clean it through that percolation process, and things like, thinking about the things you can do as an individual, planting native species, native grasses that don't require fertilizer, for example, which again, those intense amounts of water can run over and then dump into oceans, rivers, lakes, and streams. And then, picking up after your pet. It's a really significant one, surprisingly. All right, next we're going to talk about warming in the Gulf of Maine. So that's ocean temperatures. And so basically the waters in the Gulf of Maine are warming at 3 times that of the global average. And so along with that warming trend, we're also seeing an increase in acute marine heat waves. So in the same way we might have a heat wave on land, we're also seeing those in the ocean. And that has impacts because it can cause sort of deoxygenation, I think I'm saying that correctly, which is just the fact that warmer waters can't hold as much oxygen as colder waters. And so that has huge impacts for marine life, and particularly those smaller organisms that are kind of at the foundation of the food chain overall. And then acidification also has impacts for shellfish. So think about a lot of what we land here in Maine. So lobsters, clams, etc. Okay. So to jump just very briefly into why that's happening, historically, before we were seeing kind of human emissions impact the climate, the Labrador Current that was coming from up north kept the Gulf of Maine cold, right? So it's cold water coming in. With the increase in emissions and climate change, the Gulf Stream, which brings warm water up from the south, is becoming stronger. And it's actually widening and starting to push some of that warmer water into the Gulf of Maine. The Gulf of Maine is shaped kind of like a bathtub. It's shallow on the edges and deep in the middle. And so this is kind of the equivalent of taking a bath and then turning up the hot water faucet. So it's very acute here in the Gulf of Maine. In terms of the impacts, again, it comes across economy, infrastructure, and ecosystems. I forgot to mention this, but warmer waters mean that coastal storms, can be more intense. So in terms of the economy, warming waters are leading to shifts in the species that we're seeing. So lobster moving further north there, and this is looking at the Gulf of Maine overall. So Rhode Island through here. Right now in Maine, our lobsters are fine. But if we take the trends that we're seeing further south, that's something that we can expect to see change. Similarly, we've seen changes in haddock biomass density as well. So fewer haddock down south. Right now, we seem to be okay, but again, if we think of how that trend is going to shift northward, that's something that we can expect. When we think about those impacts on storms, then infrastructure also comes to the top of our minds. With those more intense coastal storms, we'll see impacts to our docks, piers, wharves, low-lying roads, etc. And then again, the ecosystem, and a lot of this goes back to thinking about, what are those organisms that are at the bottom of the food chain that are being affected even by the slightest changes in temperature or changes in pH level, so ocean acidification. This one is very fish oriented. So in terms of what we can do about ocean warming, one thing we can do is diversifying our sources and our species. So recognizing that some species of fish might be moving out of the Gulf of Maine, that also means that species of fish will be moving into the Gulf of Maine. So thinking about things like black sea bass and squid. And this is where, that community, industry, and state level of resilience becomes really important because of the permitting system, where we need to have the state ready to have permits so that fishermen can fish those species. Next, we can evolve our operations. So thinking about the fact that maybe we're not going to target a single species in the way that we have some ports in Maine landing lobster exclusively. Maybe it makes sense to diversify those species and think about how we operate to one day be able to land lobsters and the next day be able to land and process and handle black sea bass. Something else we can do is modify our infrastructure. Again, this can happen at an individual level. So if you have a private pier or a private dock, thinking about if you can move, elevate, or fortify any things that you need in order for a working waterfront to work, for example. So is there a heat pump that warms up a processing facility by the water? How close is that to flood levels during an intense storm? Can we move it somewhere else, or can we lift it up? And then finally, when we're talking about seafood, consumer education, marketing, et cetera, is really important. It's one thing to have something like squid up here in Maine, but do people want to eat it? And what can we do about that? And that's a role where if you're seeing local Maine seafood, maybe something new that you hadn't tried before, actually trying that new fish can be really, really great. All right, finally, to move into sea level rise and what's happening. So these are both data from the tide gauge in Eastport, which is the closest NOAA tide gauge to Lubeck. And what we're seeing over time is an average of 2.2 millimeters of sea level rise. So every year, again, we see variations in sea level, and I'll get to that in a minute, but overall, the trend is rising. So in Maine, we've seen about 3/4 of a foot of sea level rise since the beginning of the 19th century. And the rate of that rise is also increasing. So in the past, we were seeing about 0.07 inches of sea level rise, and that's closer to 0.14. So it's that rate of rise has almost doubled in the last 30 years. So again, we can see that we have a range of lines over here, and those are projecting what sea levels might be at the Eastport tide gauge into the future. We have 5 lines. Again, those represent the possibilities of what could happen depending on the actions that we take to curb our greenhouse gas emissions. So just to take a step back and talk about sea level and what it is. When we talk about sea level, we're talking about the average sea level. And the average sea level is influenced by a range of things. The first thing is that sea level changes. There's just year to year variation, and that could be because of storms, weather patterns, whether it's an El Nino year, for example. And then we have daily changes with our tides. So that can be 7 feet down south in Maine, or it can be as high as over 20 feet, like we see up here. Then we can have changes in sea level in the short term through storm surges as a storm moves through, as well as from wave impacts. So when we talk about sea level rise, we're not talking about tides, storm surge, or waves. We're kind of talking about sea level variability, but you don't see that like fluctuation up and down. We're really talking about that added sea level because of, well, I'll get into the because of what right now. So it's because of thermal expansion, which is one driver. So as water warms, it actually takes up more space. So it gets bigger. And so that's one thing that's driving sea level rise. And then we're also seeing melt from land-based glaciers. So just an input of more water into the seas. And then again, thinking about how the Labrador Current and the Gulf Stream interact, the Gulf Stream is also bringing that warm water up, and that's sloshing up against the side of the Maine coast. So when we look at sea level rise and how much sea levels will rise, these are the Portland sea level rise scenarios, but they reflect the ones that are being used at sort of the state. And again, we have all these different scenarios that we're looking at. And so when we look at the middle of the road scenario, we're looking at 1.5 feet of sea level rise by 2050. The high end of that scenario, or the higher emission scenario rather, is closer to 3.5 feet. As we look towards the end of the century, in that middle of the road pathway, we're looking at 4 feet of sea level rise, and at the very high emission scenario, we're looking at 8.8 feet. So again, a lot of this has to do with the choices we make when it comes to emissions. And I don't mean the choices we make just as individuals, but the choices that we make as communities at the state level and also as a global community, right? So we have multiple scales that we're looking to address. So in terms of why sea level rise matters, there are impacts to the economy, infrastructure, health, and well-being. As we know, the working waterfront economy is really central here in Maine. But beyond sort of the working waterfront and impacts to the working waterfront, which were really pronounced this last year in January, where we saw those historic storms, and we're seeing really a huge amount of investment coming in to repairing those storms, or repairing that infrastructure. There are also a ton of impacts to just our health and safety. So this is flooding at the Machias Dike. If you needed to get across that dike because of an emergency, or even if this were sunny day, high tide flooding, and you couldn't cross it, that has huge impacts, whether it's because you can't go and see, doctors or get to an emergency room or have fire services come help you out. Or again, going back to that sunny day flooding, you just have to start planning your life around the highest astronomical tides. It's not impossible, but what would the impacts of that be? Could your kids get to school every day, or would they only be able to get to school in the morning, have to hang out until the high tide goes down in the afternoon? Maybe it would work, right? But it would take a little bit of rethinking around how we want to and how we can be living our lives. And then when we think about how we can address sea level rise, we think about it in terms of a few strategies. The first being avoid. So avoid the hazard altogether. And this could mean we're not going to build in an area that is flood prone, assuming that that is already kind of open space. The next is protection. And so that could be using seawalls, for example, or dams to keep water out. The next is accommodating or living with water, right? So can we elevate structures to be able to flood? Can we create floodable parks, spaces that are meant to flood, and we don't go there when it's a high tide or during the extreme storm, but when the tide is out, maybe that's a park or a place where people can hang out and enjoy, a nice sea view. And then the last strategy is retreat, so moving out of harm's way. And that would be, not quite avoiding, but actually picking up our infrastructure and moving it somewhere else. These strategies also cross a gray to green spectrum. So gray infrastructure being traditional hard engineering solutions, which might be a seawall. And then kind of in between, we could restore dunes. So that's leveraging the services that nature already provides typically, or creating a marsh. So again, kind of a floodable space, but that has really great ecosystem benefits. So marshes act like huge sponges that just soak up water. Or again, I think of managed retreat as the ultimate nature-based solution. It's saying the water is going to go where it's going to go. We're the ones that have to move. So we're really lucky in Maine in that we have targets that have been set about by the state. So when we're thinking about planning for sea level rise, we look back at this graph and we say, well, what the heck do we plan for? I don't know what we're going to keep doing in terms of emissions. Are we going to cut our emissions right now? Are we going to be increasing them? How do I plan for something that's 100 years in the future? And so the state has provided guidance, and this is really helpful. So some of the work we do at GMRI is working with towns to do climate planning work. And where you might have towns spending months going back and forth deciding what heights should we build to, the state has said, actually, we've done some pretty great science. We've engaged with, our Department of Transportation. We've spoken to FEMA, and these are the targets that we should be looking at. And so Maine's committed to managing 1.5 feet of sea level rise by 2070 and 4 feet by 2120. So that's what we're preparing for, that's what we're committed to managing. So state agencies like the Department of Transportation are required to use sea level rise projections and sea level rise models to make sure that things like roads, bridges are going to be out of harm's way by this time. In addition to these commit to manage scenarios, we have the higher end of the spectrum, so that 3.5 feet of sea level rise by 2050, which is our prepare to manage scenario. And so that's thinking about critical services. So really like our hospitals, ambulances, evacuation routes, et cetera. And so state agencies are directed to adopt these, and that has streamlined the process for climate planning in Maine so much. So again, thinking about how resilience operates at multiple levels, efforts that the state is undertaking help communities build resilience as well.
So is it statewide or that's FORMA, right?
That's statewide. This will be statewide, yeah. So then one of the last things I want to point out is that in 2020, the Governor's Office of Policy, Innovation, and the Future developed the state's first climate action plan. So this was a really great effort. It was essentially saying, we know climate change is happening. How do we prepare for it? They started off by putting together a committee of scientists to understand and project what changes we might expect in the future. And from there, engaged industry members and communities in developing recommendations for how we reduce emissions, how we build resilience, how we modify our infrastructure. That was 4 years ago, and it's time for a new climate action plan. So the scientists and the technical experts got together and they've done their studies. And now we're in a period of time where draft strategies and recommendations have been made. So these are all on the Maine Climate Council website, and they're actually seeking feedback from communities and from individuals. So there are recommendations across buildings, infrastructure, working waterfronts, coastal marine resources, energy, transportation. I think there are maybe 12 categories that they're seeking feedback on. So again, in thinking about, what are the ways in which the state has built resilience at this larger scale, and how does that trickle down or move down towards that community and individual level, this is an opportunity to reverse that process and think about what are the things that we need at an individual level, at a community level, and how do we bring that information back up to the state? And this is one of the ways to do that. All right, next I'm going to move into the science of hope. So this is a term that I learned about from Susie Arnold, who is at the Island Institute. And essentially the sort of thesis of this argument is that hope can be learned and hope can be restored. So where climate change erodes some of our hope and makes us feel hopeless, that's recoverable. We can get that back. And so the science of hope really talks about engaging in climate in an action-oriented, hopeful way. And so we think about this through head, heart, and hands. So the head being about, well, what knowledge do we need to build to address climate, to understand the extent of the problem? And then we think about the heart, right? That's thinking about what is it that I love about Lubec? Who are the people that I can rely upon and that I trust in taking climate action? And then the last part is hands. What are the actions that I can actually take? And by engaging our heads, our hearts, and our hands, we can start to build that hope. That feedback loop is really important. Knowing about climate change alone isn't enough to address it or to feel hopeful about it. Acting on climate change, using our hands without understanding the full extent, without the support of our communities, will only get us so far. And so again, it's how do these three things work together? So I like to think of this presentation as kind of the head. Hopefully you walk away and you chat with one another. You think about, what is the resilience I have as an individual that I can lend to others, and what relationships can I build to kind of strengthen climate action. That would be the heart. And then I'm going to hand it over to Morgan to talk about the hands and an action that you can participate in anytime, but also tomorrow.
Sounds good. Thank you, Steph. So hi, everyone. My name is Morgan Glenn. I'm the AmeriCorps Resilience Fellow, and I work at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute with Steph and Sienna. I mostly work on the Coastal Flooding Community Science Project, which is a great way to take action and get involved and hopefully instill some hope. So the goal of this project is to answer the question, what water level and weather conditions can lead to local flooding? And there are a couple goals of this project. One is that community members will be out in the field recording their observations of high water and high water impacts. And that by doing this, community members and local decision makers are able to see what areas are most vulnerable to flooding and which areas people care about, because those are areas that you want to work on building resilience in first. And also, the National Weather Service uses the data to improve the timeliness of flood alerts and also improve their flood prediction models. So on our project website, there's going to be a link to it. There's a map with sites for coastal towns in Maine, and these sites have been identified as particularly vulnerable to flooding. But if you participate in this project, you're able to submit observations from anywhere that you care about. But the ones we have on there are Maori Beach, Stockford Park, the Lubeck Town Landing, and South Lubeck Road. And then they pop up on the map there. And then when you click on one, you can learn how you can get there and why it's considered particularly vulnerable to flooding. But we're still developing this out, which is why your data would be very helpful. Mm-hmm. And there's also going to be a QR code to get to the project page in the end, but we also have it in these pamphlets here, so feel free to grab one. And this is what our project page looks like. That's the map on the bottom that you can click to, and you can also learn more about the project and the actual implications of the data that you're collecting. So when you go to a site to make an observations, you take some photos with your phone, and you also enter in the time, you pinpoint yourself on the map. And if you're not at one of the locations, you just write it in the side there, just a little description. But if you mark your location on the map, it should show up. And then you describe the water level. There's drop-down menus to choose from, and they get really specific. And you also describe the waves and the weather conditions. Also part of this is you document signs of erosion and high water marks. So that would be I'll just explain what it is. But erosion, unfortunately, I think a lot of you know what erosion looks like. These were some photos that were submitted to our community science data platform. On the left, that's Stockford Park, and there's quite a bit of erosion there. And then on the right, that's the Eastern Prom in Portland, which experiences a lot of flooding. These were photos that were also submitted to the platform. The one on the left is also the Eastern Prom in Portland. And then on the right, that's Maori Beach that was submitted to the platform. But the photo on the left isn't super helpful, even though you can see ocean debris in there and you can know that the water reached that level. It's not really relative to where the ocean is. So you can make your observation really impactful if you include the ocean, like that one there. And some optional questions when you make an observation are, you can describe how it makes you feel. You can provide your own solutions for how you think it should be dealt with, which is really interesting because no place is going to be the same. So that's a good thing to really think about. And this was an observation that someone submitted from Maori Beach. They included a lot of information. It isn't necessary to be this wordy with it, but it's great because they were able to describe what has historically happened and compared to the future. And they also had some great photos. And you can see where they were on the map and the time of the observation. So that's the general idea. And this project is continuing to evolve. It's going to be easier to see how your observations pair with real-time water level data. So if you see flooding in an area, but then you're able to compare it to a tide chart, and then you can see that wasn't even the highest tide. So then you can anticipate that the water can be higher than that. So it'll make the tool more useful for you in the future. And this is a postcard. We have some of them up here, and it just explains some upcoming high water. We have some coming next week and for the rest of the fall. The circles in blue represent some of the highest tides of the year. So that'll be a great time to go out and make some observations if you stay safe. And this is that QR code again, but it's also available up here. Yeah. Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit about how the Maine Climate Action Plan dovetails with FEMA, with what FEMA is or is not doing?
So it doesn't really, would be my kind of component, just because we're looking at different levels of governance. So we're looking at what the state is doing, and then we're looking at kind of what the federal government is doing. So I would say what FEMA does and says would influence what happens at the state level, but not necessarily the other way around. So, you know, I don't think that Maine is going to be doing away with the flood insurance maps that we're currently getting from FEMA, for example.
Because
Of the National Flood Insurance Program is one of the only ways in which most people who aren't, you know, paying those like really high rates, are getting their flood insurance, right? So the National Flood Insurance is discounted insurance rates for flooding. With that being said, there's a lot of room that maybe doesn't come from the state, could come from the state, or state agencies to educate coastal residents about what is and isn't covered by flood insurance, which is a huge gap that we're noticing following those January storms. So people that had flood insurance realizing that insurance only covered still water flooding, right? So flooding that was not caused by wind or by waves, right? Which doesn't happen all that often, right? So, yeah. So the Maine Climate Council is kind of trying to collect that type of feedback to understand what are the gaps between perhaps national programs and then what could be covered at the state level. Again, that can be really important when it comes to trying to get money coming from the federal government and into Maine communities as well. Yep.
Is your agency involved in the health of seagrass, kelp? That to me is pretty critical for all the different critters in the ocean.
So not my department at GMRI specifically, but a lot of the scientists in our lab do work on ecosystem monitoring and ecosystem modeling, and so that would fall into some of the work that they do. We have sort of a couple of folks that have expertise in seagrass, but we don't have specialists that are working on seagrass or field bed restoration.
How about green crabs?
Yes, yeah. So green crabs is a big.
They come up in your presentation there. That it's an ongoing problem. It seems to be getting worse every year, and it could have a big effect on climate and so many other things that mussels, everything that's doing.
Yeah.
Green
So-
grass, you said?
Green
Green crabs.
Yes.
So green, yeah, they're invasive. They feed on those like larval stage critters, and are out competing a lot of what's going on. That is another one of our community science project areas. So we've got coastal flooding. We have some other sort of vernal pool, pond monitoring work, and then invasive green crabs. So going out and looking for green crabs, taking pictures of where they are, hopefully getting rid of them. So it's kind of cruel, but got to deal with them somehow. And And there are some pretty innovative strategies, I think, that people are coming up with for green crab management as it becomes a problem. So there's work to think about, well, what is the marketability of green crab? It's really difficult because they're quite small. It's labor intensive to try and pick them and turn them into any type of food product. But what's pretty cool is that at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, we're looking towards a lot of the new Mainer community to think about, well, we eat fish in a particular way, but that's not the case around the world, right? So how do people use crabs in other countries and other cultures? Is there a market for that here in Maine?
Can they develop a market?
And can you develop a market for
And
that?
restaurants have come up with a way to get people to start eating. But
In Thomaston, they're currently working on a TIF district for their downtown waterfront, and they're wondering if through that TIF, they might be able to pay clam harvesters to actually go out and manage green crabs in addition to clamming. So there's some pretty interesting things happening in the state.
when you were showing the graphs of the three different things that could happen over the different periods of time, what was the base that you used that, what entity had to improve? Was it the state of Maine? Was it the US as a whole? Was it New England,
Yeah, so those are global models.
global model?
Yeah, and so those,
We can't directly, we'll have a minor input into it, but
we'll have a,
actually,
we'll have a minor input into it, and there's still a lot of ways that we can address those impacts. And so the RCPs, the concentration pathways, the representative concentration pathways, are what is used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. So those are pathways, socioeconomic pathways that a lot of social science has gone into developing those as well. They're global.
and so on there.
But these impacts are localized,
Yeah.
so that the temperatures that we might expect to see themselves are local to
But
me.
it's what's happening around the world that's gonna have major affecting the major effect. When you talked about things being affected, like the local supply of seafood and everything, how about the government itself, as to who they allow to come in, how many fish they can catch, quotas and stuff like that? Are you involved in that at all?
So through some of our fisheries, like we have a fisheries adaptation kind of research group. And so they look at more of the ecosystem changes, and then based off that, they're thinking really heavily about fisheries adaptation specifically. So they haven't come out with any kind of recommendations yet. There's another group at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, which is the Marine Resource Education Program. And they work directly with fishermen to make sure that they have the knowledge and information needed to participate in the fisheries management system, which is notoriously difficult and have high barriers to being able to participate and just understand all of these processes. So our MREP program, they go out, they're active in actually across the entire United States. They're starting to do work in the Pacific as well, to educate fishermen and make sure that they have a solid seat at the table in the decision-making process.
Well, I'm sure you paid real close attention what happened up to Alaska with the crabs on that there. I don't know whether they figured out that there could be something similar happen to lobsters and crabs around this area.
Not sure. And one of the biggest challenges with that is that change is scary, right? And so it's how do you make sure that people have the information and are, comfortable and heard in that process and want to be a part of it and want to participate as well.
Are there, here in Maine, getting less global, from the border, New Hampshire up here, are there some communities like ours where the Main Street is right there in the flooding?
Yeah.
That are getting further with the discussions about relocating their Main Street or elevating it? Like, is there some models going out where communities are actively making these decisions?
Not yet. I think we're still in that stage of understanding what the impact would be. And yes, it's a heavy lift in terms of science, but that's the easy part of the equation, right? So what's incredible in Maine is how much of our coastline is built on fill. So if you go anywhere and you see a water street or First Street or Commercial Street, and it's back from the water, that's where the water used to be, right? So those areas on fill are is what's going to be affected first and most. And so a lot of places are still in that stage of figuring out what the risk from coastal flooding is, and then starting to have those hard discussions about whether they should move or not. What's interesting is that there are some towns that are zoning differently. So in southern Maine, there's a hazard overlay zone in towns like Kittery. And so that's a zone that goes on top of existing zones that says this is a place that might be impacted by coastal flooding. And through that zone, they'll limit certain uses. So they might limit, no, you can't put a hospital here, right? Or no, we can't have super dense like multifamily housing in this zone that we know gets flooded. So that's one method that fits maybe less into the retreat, but more avoid. The challenge with retreat is, we can think over here of the fish shacks, right? And McCurdy Smokehouse. What does it mean to move that? What does it mean to let that go? That's a very emotional decision. That requires a ton of, community conversations and a lot of people being on board with that idea. So it's such a hard nut to crack, and that one sits so much more in sort of the social side of things, where then you look at all the complicated computer models and you're like, whew, that's easy.
Yeah, I knew I was asking the end road question,
Yeah.
which isn't the end road, but it's the preparation stage.
Yeah.
And we don't know how imminent and how fast the rise is. So, our selectmen here, for example, this is the time I think we need to be organizing.
And another part of that challenge is, what happens if that's someone's home? What happens when it's private property?
Right.
So huge investment is needed. Is it a buyout program? Do people voluntarily locate? Are they going to be forced to relocate? And what are the intricacies of that? One thing I will note when it comes to working waterfronts specifically, which is another area that I work in, is that working waterfronts are unique in that they can get wet, right? So we talk about how the number of working waterfronts here in Maine is decreasing and we're losing access. If relocation were to become an option, we're thinking about what are we relocating? We're really thinking about those things that can't get wet. So maybe there's an opportunity there as well for the things that can get wet, whether that's a working waterfront or the creation of a marsh, to really take advantage of the opportunity that retreat could provide as well. And with that come a whole slew of co-benefits like flood management with a marsh, for example, or restoring a marsh that used to be there and isn't anymore. Yeah.
Do you experience any resistance to the ideas that you expressed in terms of the John Q. Public or whatever?
Yeah, definitely. There have been a few times where we've been out, measuring elevations to see what would flood. Someone asks what we're doing, we tell them, and they're like, "Oh, you're crazy." I'm like, well, maybe. It's I do feel crazy all the time, I'm not gonna lie. But again, that's where the state has really, I think, played a significant role through the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future. There's a program that's called the Community Resilience Partnership. And through that partnership, coastal communities, not just coastal communities, towns throughout the state of Maine are able to get grant funding from the state government to do climate action planning or to replace their light bulbs in all municipally owned buildings with LEDs, to actually start taking action to reduce emissions or build resilience. And in order to be a part of that program, towns have to officially state and declare climate change is an issue. It's an issue that we are going to take action on. And so there are some amazing organizations that are doing on the ground work to build buy-in for that. It's incredibly powerful to tie funding to, saying the sentence climate change is real. One of those organizations that has really moved the needle in this area in particular is a Climate to Thrive. They put in the chargers here at the library. They, an example would be the town of Tremont on MDI. 5 years ago, they said, no, we don't want to talk about climate change. It's not a problem. We're not going to address it. this last year, we completed a climate vulnerability assessment that led to a climate action plan for the town. And so within the span of 5 years, with a lot of support from a Climate to Thrive and the Community Resilience Partnership, they went from saying climate change isn't a problem to having a climate action plan. 5 years is pretty good. It's pretty quick. So there's a lot of hope there too.
There is I don't know if anybody lives in the UTs, unorganized territories, but there is a meeting on Wednesday, August 28th at Copsmith Institute with the state people about the unorganized territories doing something because we're unorganized.
Yeah.
Really, we call ourselves the disorganized. But anyway, this flyer I've been complaining about because it's not in English. I don't know, I sort of know what resilience means. I now know what resilience means, but it's not gonna attract a lot of people with a lot of, I don't know what we call it, Augusta language or something. Just, it's a different level that we're not there yet in terms of talking like that. But we'll see.
You bring up Tremont, and I have been, because we know
Yeah.
of there. Would that be one of the most active smaller communities in the state? And I always think of cross-fertilization. In other words, their process being shared with other communities that have the same vulnerability.
Yeah, so again, I think A Climate to Thrive is a fantastic organization in that regard. Once a month on Mondays, they host a webinar called Local Leads the Way. So really emphasizing the fact that all of this action follows like local initiatives, right? Climate action and how towns undertake these actions. They happen with conversations in the library, conversations at the grocery store, and then people getting together and saying, well, maybe we should form a climate action committee, a climate resilience committee.
Right.
So all of these efforts, I mean, most towns in Maine don't have more than one full-time staff person. They certainly don't have a planner. And so that's a huge role for just community members, active residents to fill and really push that process forward.
Interesting. Thank you.
Do you ever do, does your agency ever do films that you put on like YouTube where you can go in, where they do an update as to what you've been involved in and what progress you made?
Not that I know of. We do kind of annual reports, but
Not a video or something that the public could access?
Sienna can't.
Yeah, there's a couple things I think I'm like all the way back here. Hi, everybody. There are a couple things, I wouldn't say necessarily like, Steph was saying, there's not something that's always like on like the monthly kind of cadence or anything like that, but the Gulf of Maine Research Institute does have a lot of Gulf of Maine explained videos, maybe not a lot, but several, that are accessible that might add some more context or information to like today's conversation. There's a Gulf of Maine explained on like sea level rise and warming, and there's also been right, you said like past publication around like annual warming trends and things like that for the Gulf of Maine Research Institute has been a part of, but yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah.
I just asked, as a retired teacher now, what is your educational background and how did you get to this? Like you said, you're with AmeriCorps, which I'm familiar with.
So I went to Bowdoin College, which is why I'm now in Maine. All that credit goes there. And I did environmental studies and history. So for me, it's always been a question of how did we get to the decisions that we have gotten to now. I think there's a lot that we can learn from the past. And thinking about addressing climate change as something that's really scary. What are the things that we hold on to as we adapt moving forward? After my undergraduate degree, I moved to Shanghai and Hong Kong, where I was teaching environmental studies and global politics. And after that, I decided to get my master's degree in environmental policy and planning, which is what brought me back to the US. When I was doing that coursework, I just kept on coming back to Maine. They're like, you can write an essay about this. You can do a policy analysis or a plan analysis for anywhere in the US. I was like, well, obviously, I'm going to do Maine. So that's how I ended up back here.
Coastal meetup tomorrow?
Yes. So tomorrow we're going to be meeting at Stockford Park at 9:30 to collect a flood observation together. So if you're interested, that's where we'll be. It's an opportunity to really go through that process that Morgan described and contribute data to the project.
And so can we learn to do that? Is that what you want?
Yep, that's the purpose of tomorrow's meetup.
Yeah, that's where we start.
Thank you all.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.